officially my last of this series. We're getting to the end of the cheat sheet. This will be just a few miscellaneous things I want to throw in there. First of all, there are a whole lot of different ways to use watercolor. You can use salt. What you do is you get I don't have any salt with me, but you get your paper very wet. And with paint, you get a lot of wet paint on there. You sprinkle salt, and I literally mean table salt, kosher salt, any kind of salt, and you throw it into the paint, and you let it dry. What happens is the grains of salt will suck up some of the paint, and it'll leave a really interesting pattern and effect. So some areas will have the paint drawn in certain ways. The bigger the crystal, the bigger the crystal of the salt, the more paint it will draw in, the more water it will suck in. And basically you just let it dry, and then afterwards you brush the salt off, and it can create some really interesting patterns. Another way you can do some things with patterns, let me try and find it really quickly. You can splatter paint. An example is this one right here, where I splattered some of the paint around just to create an interesting textural effect. It adds a little bit of visual excitement to something. Basically, again, you load your brush very, very well with paint. I can do it just a second. But you really want to make sure you've got a really good saturation of paint in there. And you literally just flick. You can also use a toothbrush and run your fingers along the bristle, but anything you can do like that, that's a little bit much, but you can do it in any kind of thing in order to create some more texture and some more interest. It's a fun way of adding it. Alcohol also adds some effects to something. It makes the paint move in a certain way as well. Some people also, I showed you sort of earlier in one of the other videos, but you can either mix colors in your palette, by which I mean you can get a pink and a blue and make a purple, for example, or you can do it on your actual paper. And what happens when you mix paint on your paper is you can't totally predict it, and it doesn't 100% become all the same color. So you'll have patches of the color that'll be one shade and patches of the color that'll be the other shade. And you can see them all mixed together. And what can happen is that can add some really interesting visual effects, because color in real life is not always monochrome. It's not always a single color. And color in a painting is often more interesting too if you have little subtle variations and little subtle grades. And what happens when you let it mix on the paper is, again, you get some natural variation that can make it a little bit more interesting, a little bit more visual appeal. I don't know if that's really showing up or not. But there are just different ways where you can play with watercolor. Different effects that as you get further on in your practice, you may want to try to vary what you do with things. Let's see what else we have. Oh, palette. Actually, wait, we'll talk about palette in a minute. There are also different kinds of medium. There's watercolor that comes in tubes, and that's what this is. I've squeezed them out of the tubes into my palette. There is watercolor that comes in what they call pans. Pans, basically, they come pre-mixed. You can get a set that already has all of your little colors poured out in it. And what you do is you just wet these and reactivate them. The same with color that you've poured from tubes. It will dry over time, but all you do is add water, and it'll return to its consistency that you want it. So that there are tubes, like I said, there are pans. There are also watercolor inks, which actually come in a bottle, just like an ink bottle. They have very, very vivid, intense colors. Dr. Phil Martin's is one of them, for example. But they also can dry very quickly. So sometimes they can be harder to manipulate. Once they've dried, they can be hard to change. But they do have extremely intense, very beautiful colors. And another possibility to play with is watercolor pencils. Watercolor pencils are basically concentrated watercolor. And that might not be a good color to show up. Let's try a green. But you have a couple choices. You can draw them on paper and then wet them. And they can start bleeding together like watercolor. You can also wet the nib first. Stick the watercolor pencil in there in the water first and then draw with it like that. Some people use watercolor pencils completely. They only use watercolor pencils. Other people use it to add details to work that they want to have a very fine, very sharp point or a very, very fine line, and they feel they can't do that as effectively with a brush. So they sharpen their pencil up and use a pencil to use it to make create the fine details. Some people also make their outlines. When you go to paint a picture, most people, if you're like me, can't just paint the image they want. They draw it first on pencil. And as we discussed in our first lesson, a lot of watercolor is transparent. So you can see marks underneath your paper. So when you do go to make your outline, you want to make it very, very light. If you're going to do a pencil outline, make it as light as possible. You can also use something called a kneaded eraser, kneading like kneading bread, to gently lift up as much of your outline as you can. You press down instead of rub. When you rub with an eraser, you risk damaging the paper. So kneaded erasers are very good for watercolor paper because they won't damage the surface of the paper. Instead of rubbing, you press, and it'll start pulling up some of the marks to the point where you can barely see it again. So it leaves it as light as absolutely possible. However, as I mentioned, watercolor is transparent. So some colors, especially yellows for some reason, which are very, very translucent, your pencil lines will still show through. And that's actually acceptable in watercolor. Even professional watercolorists, sometimes you can see their pencil marks. So for some people, it just doesn't bother them. But if you really want perfection, what some people do is they'll make their outline out of colored pencil. For example, if they're going to make a duck that will likely be yellow or something like that, they'll use the yellow pencil to make the outline on their paper. And then when they come in later with the yellow paint, what happens is that line will start to dissolve and you'll no longer have a hard outline. So it takes care of pencil lines, basically. So that's one possibility if you're interested in that. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh, line and wash. There is also a style of watercolor, basically. It's technically a mixed media because what it is an outline is made in pen, basically in an ink pen. And then you go in and you fill in the color with watercolor paint. You want to make sure you get a bleed-proof ink to do that, but it can also be a very interesting mixed media form of art in its own that uses watercolor but also ink. So there are a lot of possibilities out there. One thing I forgot to mention is a palette. Excuse me. I strongly prefer porcelain. It's a little bit heavy. You can also use ceramic. There are plastic palettes out there, but what happens is they tend to stain. Or even some metal ones do as well. For example, I don't know if you can see, but this is a metal one, and you can still see there are traces of blue paint, which are staining paints, from previous uses. And the main problem with that is sometimes if there is a little bit of paint left in your palette, when you go to mix other colors, sometimes it can pick up with it. It can pick up pieces of those other colors, and it can create a color you're not really looking for. It can also make it harder if the background is the background of your palette is not a clear white. It can make it harder for you to tell what color it is you're mixing. The beauty of ceramic or porcelain, first of all, it's very cheap. Usually you can go to like Walmart or Ye Olde Pottery Barn or something like that and get something like this for $1. It is heavy, like I said, that's a drawback, but it washes completely clean. So for example, after I'm done with my watercolors, if I want to come along, I can literally get every bit of the paint off of here. It dries very easily and it dries completely cleanly. So that's why I love having a porcelain palette. Let me think, anything else, little fun things about that. One thing, and it's on the cheat sheet, but very, very important. Watercolor does not completely dry. It dries to the touch. However, it can be reactivated very easily. Meaning, if you get it wet at a future date, you risk having splotches, having blooms, having things like that, or just smearing your paint. So when you are finished with it and you are very happy with it, you want to make sure you protect it. That would be plastic. You can get portfolios. You can have plastic sleeves that will protect it, or you can go ahead and put it in frames. But don't leave it out, even sneezing or coughing or anything like that. You risk damaging the thing you worked so hard for, and that would be a shame. So just make sure you take good care of it. The last thing I want to touch on are where do you go from here? There are tons of YouTube videos. I listed some people I really like. You can search either watercolor painting, or you can also search by artists. There's a watercolor magazine. The library is an excellent resource for free books. Just look in the art department or for watercolor. There are used bookstores like thriftbooks.com that have, for $3 you can get works that are books that originally sell for $25. You can get 5 books for $15, and they're an excellent place to start looking at some ideas and things like that. There are also several Facebook pages. I belong to Watercolor for Beginners, and have excellent resources. People share their art and share ideas and solutions for problems. But anyway, the most important thing is just have fun. And don't get frustrated with it. Watercolor can be very frustrating because, like I said, it's kind of like trying to control water is sometimes trying to get a toddler to do what you want. It has a mind of its own. But if you stick with it, it can create really beautiful things. And it can teach you things like patience, which obviously I haven't completely learned yet. But it also can teach you just to let things happen. Let the water do beautiful things, and let the paint do beautiful things, because it has a great potential for being a hobby that you'll love the rest of your life. Thank you.